Good morning, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us. We're joining the BC Treaty Commission as we release our 2014 annual report. We're very pleased to see you here. I want to start out, of course, by acknowledging that we are on the traditional territory of the Songhees and the Esquimalt nations, and I thank them for allowing us to be here, to be using their beautiful territory. It's such a fine morning out there. It's hard to believe that there's fog somewhere because a few of our colleagues are not able to be, and people that we'd invited to join us today weren't able to join us because of being caught up in the fog. So I want to recognize also, before we get started, some of the guests that we have in the room. We have from the First Nations Summit. We have task group members, Robert Phillip, and I know we have Cheryl Kasner. She must have just, she's on the phone. And we also have the chair. And Ray. I also want to call you Ron, and I know Ron is wrong. Ray Harris and Howard Grant. And Cheryl just rejoined us. Sorry about that, Ray. You're always going to be Ron when I look at you. And we have a special guest with us today, Miles Richardson, former Chief Commissioner. Thank you for being here, Miles. And of course, my colleagues, Dave Haggard, Dan Smith, Celeste Haldane, and Jerry Lampert. Our 2014 report is the last report that I'm going to be involved in as Chief Commissioner. And we've it's been a very interesting and a very fulfilling 5 years that I've been here with the as Chief Commissioner, working with my colleagues. And we saw that we wanted to do this year, the annual report this year, a little bit different. And we are the keepers of the process. And we've said before that the process that was developed by the three parties started back in 1992, that process, that Maiden BC process, that is a process, it works. That's why we have treaties. But it only works when you put a commitment to it. All three parties put a commitment to it. We, of course, we've had year after year of the problems that we've raised from each of the three principles. But we see as we get closer and we get more tables moving closer to reaching final agreement and to implementing their treaties, that this whole situation of overlapping claims and shared territory becomes more and more important. And so we chose this year that we would focus on that issue, that we would help try to define it, because I think before you can really get into something, you need to know what it is you're dealing with, define it, and then support the First Nations in being able to actually put a process into place where they can deal with and resolve their overlapping and shared territory issues. And in order to address this, what I've called a thorny issue, in order to address that, we've reached out to leaders and to experts. We interviewed my fellow Chief Commissioners, former Chief Commissioners, Miles Richardson, and also the former Lieutenant Governor of British Columbia, Stephen Point. We also drew on the expertise of people such as Vince Reddy, mediators of his caliber. And in looking at the question from the legal side, we reached out to Marvin Storrow. And everyone, right across the board, Stephen, Miles, Vince, everyone agreed that what we need is a structured process to deal with this, structured process to support First Nations. So that you're working on something, you've got milestones, and in order to move forward, you've got to meet those milestones. And we also featured First Nations experts, because we've had First Nations success on this question. We've got the Tla'amin and the Tsimshian, two of the ongoing discussions. And they've resolved these issues themselves. Others are doing so in a more modern and economic development. There's something that is easier for people to imagine, to capture. And that's the agreement that we all witnessed just last week between the Musqueam, the Squamish, and the Tsleil-Waututh on the former Jericho lands and the other pieces there. That is where the question of how to share territory was the historic question of that was set aside, looking at how we're going to move forward and how we can do that together so everybody benefits. And that's really what we're looking for. And I think that that's what really all First Nations are looking for in dealing with this question. Now, while we had that ongoing question, June 28th, of course, we had the Chilcotin decision came down. And we looked at that decision, and like everyone else thought, yeah, this is a major decision that is going to impact all the negotiations. And we wanted to ensure that we had some good legal analysis of how this particular decision is going to impact the treaty negotiations. And so we turned to Marvin Storrow and to the legal firm of Blakes to give us that legal interpretation, which again is in our annual report. But some of the points of that is that Chilcotin didn't just determine Aboriginal title for the first time in Canadian history. I mean, yeah, it did that. But it also recognized First Nations sovereignty. However, with just having that title without governance is only half the story. The courts did address governance in Chilcotin to an extent around the Forest Act. And I think that gives us then a basis of how governance then can be interpreted for many, many other jurisdictions. But just having title without the structure of governance in order to implement that title is, as we call it, only half the story. The court did not, and is really not set up to deal with any question other than the very specific question that they were asked, the very direct question. And they say themselves that the court is not set up to deal with this larger question, that what you really need to do is, and the courts continue to encourage the three parties to the negotiation table. We have court case after court case that says that. The First Nations recognize that dealing with overlapping claims and shared territory is something that we need to deal with internally. We recognize that as the task group report was being written, and it became recommendation 8 of the task group report. So, as you can see on the cover of our annual report, we quote recommendation 8. And we quote the expertise and all the reports that have come out. It's just been one report after another. We've had even the Senate Standing Report that came out in 2012 said the same thing. More recently, though, the Eiford report. Douglas Eiford is, as you know, has been appointed to another special ministerial position. He was there a little while ago and looking at how we can move forward in terms of the resource development. And now he's looking at the changes to the comprehensive claims process. And we say here in British Columbia that the comprehensive claims process, as it applies in British Columbia, is the BC Treaty negotiation process. It's the Made in BC process. That's how we deal with comprehensive claims, not whatever is going to be carried on throughout the rest of the country. But Eiford, in his report in 2013, he made 3 recommendations to address overlap. And this is on page 27 of our report. He made the 3 recommendations, but most importantly, he said, Canada should encourage and support Aboriginal initiatives that have the potential to address shared territory, including between Aboriginal organizations, or between the Aboriginal groups rather, and the overlaps or the discussion that needs to happen between Aboriginal people and industry and governments. So this was really why we made the decision. We thought, everyone's talking about it. You know, we know that it's an issue. We hear a lot of political rhetoric coming from the First Nations, as opposed to actually having a process, something that's structured where you could sit down and actually start dealing with this. And we thought, well, one way that we can encourage that is by concentrating and by trying to develop some of the responses on how the First Nations can move forward. We also, in this report, lay out that it's time to move and get the work done. No more studies. One of the things that we're concerned about is that the Supreme Court decision is going to lead, like all Supreme Court decisions usually do, is going to lead to a couple years of inaction coming from the federal and provincial governments, because they need to study what the decision is about. We see that we're very concerned as a commission. The principals have not had a face-to-face meeting since last December. And that is not because there's been any reluctance from either the provincial government or the summit. It's basically been the federal government. Again, they are the ones that are holding up this process. The principals need to meet. They should be meeting at a minimum 3 times a year, because they're the ones that are giving direction to their people at the negotiating tables. And if they don't meet for months on end, they've gone as much as 1.5 years without meeting. Think, well, no bloody wonder this whole process isn't moving the way that it should be. In yesterday's throne speech, there was lots of material in there, but there's one piece that we thought was very interesting that I wanted to point out and just make a comment about. In the throne speech, they said that leadership means developing a real partnership with First Nations and giving them the opportunity to participate meaningfully in a thriving economy. Well, we recommend as a commission that it should also mean it is about giving businesses the opportunity to participate meaningfully with First Nations on First Nations title lands. That is the reality. That is tomorrow's reality. It's no more just First Nations kind of second thought. They're front and center now. Thank you very much. We're open for questions, and be happy to turn it over to my colleagues to answer. Any questions?
You did a study of the commission that kind of details where the overlaps are and how extensive they are.
We have information. We don't have like one book like this that says what they are. We have, I believe it's on the back page. We have some of the protocols, where people have actually worked on their overlaps and have had some measure of success. But in terms of having one study, Mark? Oh yeah. That's we always do an update on each of the tables, and so the overlaps have been recognized in that information. It's starting at page what? 29. It starts on page 29. Okay. Yes. Yes. Yeah. Though many of them, yes. There are also First Nations that are further in the process, but because of different reasons, they've stalled. And a couple of them that I can think of, it's because of overlapping claims. So there are some First Nations that have been at the table for the whole time, but we can see that it's just not going anywhere. They're just spinning their wheels. And unfortunately, the government's response to that is to send in negotiators who have no mandate to close any kind of deal. It's just to, pretend that this is happening. And so we've noticed that. I mean, we've pointed that out for the last few years. We've said that there are some tables where everyone knows that you're not going to end up with a treaty here. There has to be an exit strategy. Everyone nods their head, yeah, we got to have an exit strategy, but we haven't even started one yet. And so we're saying an exit strategy has got to start with loan forgiveness. That First Nation has got to be able, you remember why they came to the table. They came to the table in good faith, figuring they're going to end up with a treaty at the end of the day, something that's going to be good for their people in order to move forward. That's not happening, so something else needs to be put in place for them. They can't move ahead on economic development if they're carrying this major debt. Yeah, Jerry? It wouldn't really be fair, yeah. But I mean, you can kind of read that in our report, yeah. Yeah, all I can say about in terms of the money is that the money has reached the point where whatever payment they're going to receive as part of a treaty is going to be wiped out.
That's what I was going to add. As part of a final agreement, there's a component called the capital transfer. This is an amount of money, mostly funded by the federal government, that goes to the First Nation. Out of that capital transfer, over a period of time, the First Nation will pay back the debt, the amount owed to government. And that's happening now in Tsawwassen, and I believe it's happening in Mulnuth. The problem is, some First Nations are getting close to final agreement, and the amount of the capital transfer on the table so far almost equals the debt. Mm-hmm. So they'd be left with nothing in terms of ongoing contribution to what they want to do once they gain their final agreement. So it's a problem.
Yes. 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 Yeah, Mr. Haggard sits at that table, and I know he'll be happy to talk about that.
As shy as I am about talking, sure. What they did is that we started it, and then the two nations within the 7 Tsimshian nations said, we're okay, we'll work out an agreement, and then they worked out a protocol agreement between the two, where they both agreed that whatever happened in the other's territory was okay as far as treaty settlement lands is concerned and economic development. That's not the only example, though. There's the one that was done in Alberni with Mulnuth and the Tishat. They worked out an agreement where one was right on top of the other in the Alberni Inlet. They worked out an agreement with the Treaty Commission's help. I think it was Tsawwassen worked out an agreement, and it's a slow process. But what they do is, what's happening is the elders play a large part in working out the scenario, whatever it looks like, because they have the history and they know how the shared territory was utilized in the past. So it's really important in my mind that the elders play a significant role in whatever the solution is.
Mm-hmm. Yes. Well, it's difficult because that barn door has been opened a long time ago. There are not very many First Nations that would be actually entering the treaty negotiations at this point. We've got a pretty good chunk of that are already part of the process, even though maybe they're not negotiating right now. So we do have a directive that needs, and when this process was created, we were all building something new. And, you know, certainly Miles can speak to that because he was, you know, right there at the beginning and laying this out. And it was just, it seemed so natural. I mean, it just made sense that we were going to do that kind of decision amongst ourselves. However, no one expected that we're still going to be here talking about this all this time later. And the way that the process was set up, we didn't actually bring in saying that you must have your overlapping claims dealt with before you got to a certain stage. And so that's why you have First Nations that are all the way to signing a final agreement and still not having their shared territory issues and overlapping claims already settled. So as part of this process that we're talking about, where we put into place a structured process, that's where we're saying that there has to be certain milestones. And very, very clear that this doesn't mean that one First Nation will have a veto over another First Nation. Very, very clear, no, that we say that there's certain milestones, you do the work that you need to do, and if you still can't reach a decision, that First Nation who's borrowed money, who's been sitting in good faith at negotiation tables, their treaty must go forward. Yeah, so that's it.
Thank you. One of the recommendations that the Commission has been making over the last couple of years is with regards to funding and ensuring that there's access to secured contribution funding for nations to come together and address their overlapping and shared territory issues. This also helps those nations that are outside the treaty negotiation process because we have tables where their neighbors are not actively negotiating, so they also need support financially with human capacity, and that's also where the Commission has been moving into helping to support these negotiations and these shared territory discussions as they move through the process. So there's two recommendations, I think, for the Commission looking forward around secure access to contribution funding to support shared territory and overlap initiatives. And so that's something that we look to our partners, federal and provincial government, to continue to support.
So is stumbling block funding or
Well, I think that it's all of those, and there's a lot of history there. The creation of Indian reserves, that didn't help. Some people were moved from, you know, where their traditional territory was to a reserve. So there's all kinds of, so that's where I said there are historic reasons, and these just all need a venue that is secure, and a venue that is not going to be just 1 year or just 6 months. You know, it's going to be there so that the process that needs to happen can happen. Yes. Well, actually, any of my colleagues, I know that, yeah, Dave, go ahead.
If I may, Sophie, thank you. What we do is we facilitate meetings between the two nations where there's overlap, and usually it doesn't come until they're getting close to an agreement in principle. That's when people realize that there's an issue that's laying between those nations that they have to resolve. So we facilitate usually the first meeting, and we have managed to secure some funding to help pay for their expenses to come to those meetings. And really all we do is get them talking and then help them. If they don't want us involved, then we draw back. If they want us involved in a certain way, then we do that, or we'll bring in an outside mediator, as we've done on a couple of occasions with mixed successes, because mediation is never a simple process. There's too much history and too many things that are involved, but there is starting to be some successes. Unfortunately, it doesn't come until a later time in the process, and I think that's maybe where a mistake might have been made. We should have started doing it immediately 21 years ago. Maybe we would have had better success at that time.
Yes. Yes. Well, I think first and foremost that it enhances what we're doing, because it says very clearly, both in the lower court and at the Supreme Court, which was just supporting Justice Vickers' findings, that negotiation really is the best way of settling all of these issues. Like I said, it's recognized as title over a portion of their entire traditional territory. We also make a comment that actually Chilcotin was, they were true to what Recommendation 8 says, because they made sure that they had agreement with their overlapping neighbors before they went ahead in that, and they made sure that they weren't going to be in any kind of conflict in that area that they brought to court. The courts have said that they are limited in what they can recommend because they're only speaking to the question that's brought before them. So this is where we say that the decision makes it clear that what we need are long-term solutions that are properly negotiated. We also say that in the realm of the discussion around reconciliation, the truest form of reconciliation is a fairly negotiated treaty that is honorably implemented. Because again, if you just get a treaty but it's not implemented, that's only half the story too. So, well, it speaks to the fact that you need to have negotiations. You can't just be going to the court because the court can't deal with, there's a whole array of questions. If you brought the entire tray of questions to the courts, you'd never ever get out of there. It'd be, I don't know how many generations before they get through all the pieces and then try to make them connect. I mean, look at, we've already got a whole basket of Supreme Court decisions, and we still have the uncertainty around governance, around the sovereignty of First Nations in their area of jurisdiction. That's exactly my point. I think things like LNG, pipelines, you know, there's more realization. I think that it was a real wake-up call for Aboriginal title to be recognized fully by the Supreme Court of Canada. And, you know, while that decision is quite limited in terms of its application for the rest of the country, the underlying theme here from the Supreme Court of Canada over the last, I don't know, 30, maybe 40 years has always been the same. It's never changed. Yeah.
I was just going to add, I think some of the changes that we'll see are to mandates. And I think there's no longer a time where negotiators can walk into a room and say that this is a voluntary process. Quite contrary, this is based on recognition of title. And we're here to talk and negotiate around the governance pieces. I think that ship has sailed, and I think that's clear out of Chilcotin. And I think the roll-off treaty settlement lands and the shared decision-making discussions that nations will be having on how they control and contribute and govern their entire ancestral lands, traditional territory, that's now on the table. It has been, but I think it's just stronger now. And I think those are the mandates that need to change. Land quantum, there probably needs to be a discussion around land quantum, and nations know that. And I think it's sort of underpinning the reconciliation process here in BC through treaty negotiations, but it's really just filling up the basket that we already have. And I think those are some of the changes that we'll see.
Yes. No, please, finish your question. You're talking about, yeah, and well, there's been a working group dealing with certainty, and they're working towards, you know, a definition that would be agreed to by all the principals. But I think that now that we've got the decision on Chilcotin on actual title, it's going to have to change that discussion, because it was always with, you know, as Celeste mentioned, they came in with a certain position on where certainty would get us to, which in fact is not really what Chilcotin has actually said, you know, that certainty that there is Aboriginal title. And I know, Celeste, do you want to add anything more to that? You were... No? Okay. Yeah. So it's the particular court decision, I think, has really made for a lot of rethinking about some of the language that we've been using going forward. Yeah. Any other questions? Yeah, yeah.
I know that the report covering things, I cover a lot of announcements,
Mm-hmm.
very short term.
Yeah.
And the property values that are moving forward, but, are you talking about a balance scale, like we're seeing all these short term treaties or agreements?
The agreements, yeah.
But nothing more comprehensive.
Yeah, nothing leading towards certainty, which was the earlier question. Yes, we're very concerned about that. We feel that the province, and we said this last year. We were starting to notice it the year before, but it was getting clearer last year. It's really clear now that the province, they're like every other government, they're limited in the resources that they have to put into negotiations. And right now, you see that the majority of their emphasis is on these short-term agreements, which I guess is good from one election year to the next, but it really isn't good for either the economy of the province as a whole, or definitely for the First Nations in terms of their long-term development. So what we're recommending to the province is that as much resources remain and strong mandates be given to their chief negotiators that are sitting at the tables, particularly those, and you've got a whole list, and we've got about 17 tables that are at various levels of getting towards final agreement, that we put some emphasis on that and we finalize those. Instead of, getting sort of, there's LNG and other things. And that's where, if you've got some development in your particular area, you're going to get some short-term interest. Dan.
Thank you, Sophie. Just a few things I think that needs to be remembered. And that's the systemic and attitudinal barrier that still exists with respect to the negotiations between Canada and British Columbia. We also take into consideration the regional districts, municipalities, each one of island trusts, each one thinks that they have jurisdiction over lands and resources. And that's in competition with First Nations that are in those particular areas. And not all the responsibility should be on First Nations with respect to negotiations. We all have to remember, right from Pierre Elliott Trudeau to Stephen Harper, from Dave Barrett to Christy Clark, premiers, and all of the ministers in between that our respective First Nations have to respond to. Each one of those areas the Government of Canada and British Columbia have no capacity with respect to continuity in the system to negotiate. Their negotiators change, the minister responsible for Aboriginal issues change, as well as the premiers and the prime ministers. Within our own community, we have continuity because we don't move from our respective territories. So that capacity is much stronger in terms of First Nations negotiating than British Columbia and Canada. The other thing we have to bear in mind is that there are protocols with respect to resource utilization by our respective First Nations. When we talk about the Chilcotin, and I recall the Chilcotin coming to the Likwita and asking the Likwita to move their statement of intent so that there would be a clear field for the Chilcotin to move ahead in the court case. When we look at the Likwita and Sliammon protocol with respect to fisheries, now that fisheries is on the table again, then we need to be able to understand that those protocols in terms of fisheries really respect each other to say, we would like to go fishing in your territory, Sliammon, and the permission would be granted depending on the resources itself. The other challenge that our First Nations have with respect to government community forums, and just as an example, the Katzie First Nation in negotiations had a government community forum with Metro Vancouver. Now there's something like 42 different jurisdictions within the Metro Vancouver. And there's probably something very similar in Victoria with respect to the jurisdiction of the various regional districts and the communities itself. So that challenge is there. But we're working through that. So the emphasis that everyone is placing on shared territory. We've always had boundaries between First Nation and First Nation, always. And I think Lieutenant, His Honor Stephen Point had pointed that out in our report itself. But it just reinforces the fact that we had these boundaries, but we also had the protocol in our big houses and understanding that that was going to be respected. Another example would be the Hiltik and the Haida. I mean, they're miles apart and hours apart, but there is a protocol there that is being reinforced and reestablished and remembered by both Haida and the Hiltik. So not all that responsibility or blame should go to the First Nations. I think government has to bear some of that responsibility, if not all of it, so that we may be able to move forward in building our own capacity in terms of administration economic initiatives. And those economic initiatives really is an answer with respect to the province's supposed jurisdiction over the natural resources itself and the partnership that they talk about. So we need to be able to move ahead on that. The one other point that I want to make is not everyone knows the history. Everyone in an elected position in government doesn't know the history of Aboriginal peoples in Canada and the province of British Columbia. Once we start to understand that, then we'll know that we are prosperous and that we can move ahead in partnership.
Any other questions? I don't see anybody indicating it, so I want to say thank you very much for joining us, and look forward to having more discussion. If please feel free to contact our office. We've got I neglected to introduce him. We've got our Director of Process, Mark Smith, here, and our Director of Funding, Dan Gill. And and if you have any other questions from us, please feel free to call us anytime. Thank you very much.